Some debts aren't paid with money, they live in memory. Arnold Schwarzenegger hadn't seen Leroy Wilson in nearly 50 years. But one rainy night in Los Angeles, he stepped into a quiet McDonald's and saw the man who once taught him how to stand tall in a country where he barely spoke the language. That moment didn't just stir old memories. It reopened a silent vow, one that had waited a lifetime to be fulfilled. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was just past midnight when Arnold Schwarzenegger stepped out of the Grand Convention Hall in downtown Los Angeles. The applause from the evening's keynote speech still echoed in his ears, but the adrenaline had long since faded. Rain fell in slow, steady sheets, tapping against the windshield of his black Escalade as he slid into the driver's seat. He sat there a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, mind still buzzing. He had spoken to a crowd of young entrepreneurs, telling them about grit, ambition, and rising above circumstances. But now, with the city quiet around him and hunger gnawing at his stomach, he realized he hadn't eaten since lunch. He didn't want anything fancy. Not tonight. What he craved was something simple, something that reminded him of a different time. As he turned onto a dimly lit boulevard, the familiar golden arches glowed through the misty rain, casting a warm yellow haze on the wet pavement. McDonald's. He smiled faintly to himself. It had been years since he set foot in one, but in that moment, it felt right. He pulled into the near-empty parking lot, killed the engine, and sat there for another beat. The rain drummed softly on the roof as he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a well-worn baseball cap. Even now, people still recognized him. He tucked it low over his brow and stepped out into the rain. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. The place was mostly empty, just a tired-looking couple with a toddler and a man in a hoodie scrolling through his phone in the corner. The air was thick with the smell of fryer oil and warm bread. He made his way to the counter, eyes scanning the menu more out of habit than need. He already knew he'd order a Big Mac and black coffee. Behind the counter, a teenage cashier mumbled a greeting without looking up. Arnold gave his order in a quiet voice, watching the kid type it in. While waiting, his gaze drifted toward the kitchen. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the staff moved mechanically assembling sandwiches, cleaning surfaces, preparing for closing time. Then he saw him. In the back, near the mop bucket, a tall, lean man in a red apron was wiping the tile floor with long, practiced strokes. His posture was slightly hunched, but there was a rhythm to the way he moved, like a man who had done this 1,000 times. Arnold's eyes narrowed. Something about the way the man paused to wring out the mop, the way he pushed it with quiet focus, triggered something deep in Arnold's memory. The man looked up for a brief second as he repositioned the bucket. The harsh lights caught the edge of his face, angular cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that, despite the years, still held that same quiet intensity. Arnold's breath caught in his throat. No, it couldn't be, but it was. Leroy Wilson. Arnold took a step back, as if the sight had physically struck him. The last time he had seen Leroy, they were barely out of their 20s, Arnold still learning English. Leroy teaching him how to navigate America, one shift at a time. That had been nearly 50 years ago. And now, here he was, working a mop at a McDonald's on a rainy Los Angeles night. Arnold's heart pounded. The years had weathered Leroy, his hair now gray. Lines etched into his face, but Arnold would know him anywhere. Leroy hadn't seen him yet. He was focused on his task, oblivious to the man staring at him from the counter. Arnold turned slightly, lowering his head, unsure what to do. His food order was called out, the voice muffled behind the counter. He took the tray mechanically and moved to a corner booth where he could sit with a clear view of the kitchen. He didn't touch the burger. Instead, he watched. Leroy moved with care, cleaning the last stretch of tile, then straightened slowly, one hand resting briefly on his lower back. Arnold felt a knot form in his chest. How had their paths diverged so completely? He, the immigrant with a dream, now a global icon, and Leroy, the man who once told him he belonged in this country when no one else did, was mopping floors in the shadows. The rain outside continued to fall, gentle and steady, as Arnold sat frozen, memories rushing in like floodwaters. In the summer of 1971, Arnold Schwarzenegger was just another foreigner in Santa Monica, with a thick accent, a suitcase full of protein powder, and dreams too big for the cramped room he rented above a liquor store. The America he had imagined from bodybuilding magazines and Hollywood movies felt colder, grayer, harder. His English was broken. His pockets were nearly empty. And most days, he walked the streets with his eyes down, unsure of where to go or how to ask for what he needed. That all changed the day he met Leroy Wilson. Arnold had wandered into a small, rundown gym on Pico Boulevard. It smelled like metal and sweat, the kind of place where men train not for fame, but for survival. He was trying to ask the owner about a day pass when a voice beside him said, "He's asking how much for one day." Arnold turned. A tall black man in work boots and a dust-stained t-shirt smiled at him. His name was Leroy, and from that moment on, everything started to shift. Leroy didn't laugh at Arnold's accent. He didn't flinch when Arnold struggled to pronounce simple words. He asked where Arnold was from, what brought him here, and if he needed work. That same afternoon, Leroy took him to a nearby construction site where he was working part-time and spoke to the foreman on his behalf. 2 days later, Arnold was hauling bricks and pushing wheelbarrows under the California sun. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough for groceries and rent, and more importantly, it gave him his first sense of footing in a foreign land. After work, Leroy would take Arnold back to the gym. They trained together, Arnold teaching Leroy proper form, Leroy helping Arnold translate between reps. They talked between sets, the kind of conversations that stitched a friendship fast. Leroy had grown up in South Central El Araba, raised by a single mother who worked night shifts and believed in discipline, church, and keeping your word. He'd never left California, never had the chance. But his view of the world was wide. One evening, they sat outside the gym, sipping water from shared paper cups. The sun was low, casting orange light across cracked sidewalks. Arnold had asked why Leroy never left, why he hadn't chased something bigger. Leroy smiled, looked down the street as if seeing something only he could. "There's a lot of kids around here," he said quietly. "No one looks after them. They need someone, a place to go after school, somewhere safe, somewhere to breathe." Arnold listened. "I always thought maybe one day I'd open a place for him," Leroy continued. "Basketball court, maybe a study room, some food on the table. I don't know. A place that says, 'You matter.'" Arnold had nodded, not fully understanding the weight of what Leroy meant, but he felt it. That night, back in his room, Arnold wrote it down in his notebook. Not the whole sentence, just a phrase, "a place that says you matter." Weeks turned into months. They fell into a rhythm. Work in the morning, gym in the evening, late-night meals of eggs and rice, sometimes sharing stories about childhoods on opposite ends of the world. Leroy would correct Arnold's English gently, without judgment. "Don't say 'I go tomorrow,' say 'I'll go tomorrow.' And it's not 'I am want to,' it's 'I want to.'" Every correction was a small act of kindness, a gesture that said, "You're not alone." One day, after a tough shift, Arnold confessed he wasn't sure he belonged here, that maybe he'd made a mistake coming to America. He said it quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, eyes focused on the scuffed soles of his boots. Leroy didn't answer right away. Instead, he took off his gloves, wiped sweat from his brow, and turned to Arnold. "Look, man," he said, "I don't care what your accent sounds like, or where you were born. You show up early. You lift twice what most men can. You care about doing things right. You belong here, you hear me?" Arnold nodded, but Leroy repeated it. "You belong here." 3 simple words, spoken without fanfare, but with conviction, words that Arnold would carry with him through every championship, every film set, every boardroom. They lost touch eventually. Life got busy. Leroy changed jobs. Arnold got more serious about competitions, started traveling, but those months, their conversations, the sweat and struggle they shared became the quiet foundation of something lasting. And that one sentence, uttered under a California sun by a man with calloused hands and a generous heart, became something more than comfort. It became fuel. Now, decades later, sitting in a McDonald's booth and watching that same man mop the floor with quiet dignity, Arnold felt that memory rise like a tide. He remembered Leroy's voice, steady and calm. He remembered what it felt like to be lost and found in the same moment, to be seen, to be told, without condition, you belong here. And for the first time in a long time, Arnold felt like that 24-year-old immigrant again, eyes wide, heart uncertain, holding on to a promise he hadn't known he'd made. The next evening, just after 8, Arnold returned to the same McDonald's. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick with reflections of traffic lights and neon signs. He parked at the far end of the lot and sat for a moment, engine idling, staring through the windshield. Part of him wanted to keep driving, to let the night swallow the memory of what he'd seen, but something heavier pulled at him. So he cut the engine, pulled his cap low, and stepped inside. The restaurant was busier than the night before. A handful of families filled the booths, kids laughing too loudly over Happy Meals. A group of teenagers clustered near the soda fountain. A delivery driver waited by the counter, scrolling his phone. Arnold slipped into a booth at the very back, tucked behind a fake potted plant and a poster advertising 2-for-1 apple pies. From here, he had a clear view of the kitchen and the hallway near the staff room, but he was just another face in the shadow. And then he saw him, Leroy, dressed in the same red uniform shirt, the same sturdy black shoes, his name tag glinting beneath the fluorescent lights. He moved with that quiet rhythm again, not rushed, not slow, just steady. There was something noble in the way he carried himself, like every task, no matter how small, deserved to be done with dignity. Arnold watched as a younger employee, maybe 17, fumbled with a tray of drinks, nearly spilling a large soda. Instead of scolding him, Leroy stepped over, took the tray gently, and said something that made the boy smile, shoulders relaxing. A few minutes later, an older woman, clearly homeless, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothes, shuffled in from the street and hovered near the counter. The manager noticed and started walking toward her with a practiced frown. But Leroy got there first. He placed a paper bag on the counter, burger, fries, small coffee, and pushed it toward her with a nod. No words and no fuss, just kindness. The woman smiled, took the bag, and left as quietly as she came. Arnold's throat tightened. This was the same man who once gave him his first job lead. The same man who corrected his English and lent him quarters for laundry when Arnold's wallet was empty. And now, here he was, still giving, still lifting others, even when no one was watching. As Leroy moved through the shift, Arnold noticed a slight limp in his left leg. It wasn't obvious, but to Arnold's trained eye, it was there, a subtle favoring of one side, a tiny hitch when he turned too quickly or shifted his weight. Pain, probably chronic. But Leroy never paused, never complained. He just kept working. At one point, he stepped into the lobby to wipe down a table. One of the teenage customers rolled their eyes and knocked over a cup just to be funny. The soda spilled across the table, dripped to the floor. Leroy didn't react. He simply nodded, fetched a rag, and cleaned it up without a word. The teen looked embarrassed after that. Maybe it was the calm. Maybe it was the way Leroy refused to meet rudeness with anything but quiet resilience. Arnold sat frozen in his booth, untouched coffee cooling in front of him. He wanted to get up, walk over, say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. How do you thank a man who never asked for credit? How do you show up after 50 years with your success and your fame and not make it feel like a spotlight? Leroy deserved more than a public reunion or an awkward moment in front of strangers. He deserved privacy. He deserved respect. So Arnold stayed where he was, eyes never leaving the man who had once changed his life with a few simple gestures and a handful of kind words. The shift wore on. Customers came and went. The noise rose and fell. Leroy moved through it all with the patience of someone who had made peace with being overlooked. But to Arnold, he had never stood out more. The real strength, he thought, wasn't in headlines or trophies or movie posters. It was here in quiet acts of grace, in the way one man carried himself through a hard day with dignity still intact. And that was when Arnold understood. Leroy hadn't been buried by time or fated by circumstance. He had simply kept walking forward, step by quiet step, with the same heart he'd always had. And maybe, just maybe, Arnold hadn't returned to this place by accident. Maybe life had brought him here not to remember who he'd been, but to finally honor the man who helped him become who he was. The diner was quiet, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower. It sat 2 blocks from the McDonald's, tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop, its windows fogged from the cold night air outside. Arnold had chosen it for a reason. No cameras, no curious onlookers, just 2 cups of coffee, a booth by the window, and the space to speak like old friends if they could remember how. Leroy sat across from him, his hands wrapped around the coffee mug, even though the drink was still too hot to sip. The steam curled between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just full. Finally, Leroy glanced up. His voice was calm, but heavy. "I knew it was you the first night," he said. "The second you walked through that door. Even with the hat pulled low, I knew." Arnold blinked, caught off guard. "Then why didn't you say anything?" Leroy shrugged. "What was I supposed to say? Hey, remember me? The guy who used to lend you bus fare, now wiping floors while you own half of Los Angeles." He laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Didn't seem like the kind of reunion worth interrupting your burger for. Arnold leaned forward. "You were never just a guy, Leroy. You were the first person who treated me like I wasn't invisible." Leroy looked away, out the window, where the streetlights cast golden halos on the wet sidewalk. "It's been a long time. Man," he said, "a long, winding road. Life didn't turn out the way I thought it would." Arnold waited. He knew that tone. It was the same tone Leroy had used all those years ago, talking about dreams that lived in the space between shifts and late-night gym sessions. "We left overnight," Leroy continued, fingers tightening around his cup. "My father, he got into some trouble. Something about a missing shipment at the warehouse he worked at. No charges, but enough whispers to make him think they were coming for him. One night, he just packed up the car and told us we were moving to Georgia. No goodbyes, no warning." Arnold felt a sharp pull in his chest. "I thought you disappeared," he said quietly. "I knocked on your door for days." Leroy nodded slowly. "I know, and I wanted to tell you. I begged my dad to let me call, to write, but he was scared. Said the less people knew, the safer we'd be. So we changed our last name, started over in a little town outside Atlanta. By the time I figured out how to reach out, you were already famous. And I figured, you moved on." Arnold shook his head. "I looked for you. I asked people. I even hired someone once, years ago, but they couldn't find anything." Leroy's smile was sad. "Wilson became Wilkins. Didn't think it mattered. I was working jobs, factory, warehouse, school janitor. Got married, had kids, buried my wife. You know how it goes." Arnold didn't speak. He just listened. There was too much to say, and none of it felt big enough. Leroy took a breath, eyes still on the window. "I always figured I'd do something more," he said. "Not famous, not rich, but something that mattered. Remember when I used to talk about opening a place for kids' after-school programs? Basketball court, maybe a library if I got lucky. Just a spot where they felt safe. Seen, heard." Arnold nodded slowly. I remember. Leroy finally looked at him again. That never happened. Life got in the way. Bills, rent, injuries. 1 year turns into five, five into 20. Next thing you know, you're 65 and sweeping French fries off the floor. Arnold studied him, the lines on his face, the quiet strength still in his posture. The same Leroy, just older, weathered, but not broken. Leroy leaned back, exhaled a soft laugh. You know what I told myself the other night after you walked out with your burger and didn't say anything? Arnold's heart skipped. What I told myself, maybe the best thing I ever did, Leroy said, voice low, was helping some lost Austrian kid figure out how to ask for a job. Maybe that was it. My big contribution. He paused. And I wish I could say I helped someone else after that. Another young person. Someone who needed a hand. But I didn't. Not really. Just kept moving. He looked down at the table, his voice barely above a whisper. I wish I had helped someone the way I helped you. Arnold sat still, the weight of those words settling in his chest like stone. He didn't know what to say. For a man who had stood on stages, spoken to presidents, inspired millions right now, all the words had left him. Because deep down, he knew. Everything he had built, everything he had become, had started not with fame or fortune, but with this man, in a dusty gym and a borrowed language. Leroy broke the silence with a small smile. Anyway, that's enough old stories. What about you? Arnold, what's your story these days? Arnold's voice cracked when he answered, still trying to live up to what you saw in me, and for the first time in years. Leroy looked at him not as a celebrity, not as a billionaire, but as the young man he once was. And that look steady, kind, full of unspoken memory said more than words ever could. The hotel room was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes after a day heavy with memory. Arnold stood near the window, staring out at the Los Angeles skyline. The city glowed beneath him, endless lights stretching into the dark. But his mind wasn't on the city. It was somewhere far older, far smaller. A cracked gym floor, a dusty construction site, a one-bedroom apartment where he'd once sat on the floor eating rice and canned tuna while learning how to pronounce future. Behind him, the room was dim, lit only by a desk lamp. On the desk lay an old leather folder, frayed at the corners. The color faded with time. He opened it slowly. Inside were photos, newspaper clippings, scraps from a life too fast to pause, but never too fast to forget. And then he found it, a folded piece of lined paper, yellowed with age. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The handwriting was uneven, a pencil smudge at the corner. It was a note Leroy had written to him in 1971 on a night when Arnold had been homesick and lost. They had just finished a late gym session, and Leroy had scribbled it out on a napkin and later rewritten it for him. It said, "You keep going. Arnold, you're meant for something big. Maybe it won't be me who builds a place for these kids. Maybe it'll be you." Arnold stared at the words, heart pounding. Maybe it'll be you. He remembered laughing at the time, brushing it off like something friends say to each other in moments of hope. But now, in this room, decades later, it didn't feel like a throwaway line. It felt like prophecy. He reached for his phone and dialed his assistant. The call was answered on the second ring. "Tom, I need you to do something. Quietly, no press, no buzz." There was a pause on the other end. "Of course. What is it?" Arnold's voice was firm. "I want to acquire a property in South A, big enough for 2 basketball courts, classrooms, kitchen, offices. I'll need architects, builders, youth program consultants, everything. And I want it done fast. Is this for a foundation?" "No," Arnold said. "This is personal." By the next morning, the wheels were already in motion. His team in Chicago transferred funds. A trusted real estate agent began scouting properties near Leroy's neighborhood. Arnold spent hours reviewing community maps, traffic flow data, school zones, anything to understand the pulse of the place Leroy had never left. But it wasn't about numbers. It was about people, about impact, about keeping a promise that had never been spoken, but had always lived beneath the surface. Arnold visited an old department store off Central Avenue. The building had been closed for years. The windows boarded up, the roof slightly sagging, but the bones were strong. The space was big, and in his mind, Arnold could already see it: kids running drills on polished hardwood, others hunched over homework in quiet rooms, the smell of real food from a working kitchen, a place where no one felt like an outsider, a place that said, "You belong here." He walked through the empty halls with a clipboard and a hard hat, but his thoughts were miles away. He remembered Leroy showing him how to pour concrete, how to brace his knees when lifting. He remembered how Leroy brought extra sandwiches to the job site and always offered him half. He remembered the day he asked Leroy why he did so much for someone he barely knew. Leroy had smiled and said, "Because giving is strength. Man, it's not just what you carry on your back, it's what you lift in others." That line returned now, sharp and clear. Giving is strength, not just what you carry on your back. Arnold wrote it down on the first page of the project file. At the top, in bold ink, he wrote the working title, "The Wilson Center." Over the following weeks, architects drew blueprints. Contractors submitted bids. Community organizers offered ideas. Arnold worked quietly, behind the scenes, making calls, reviewing proposals, pushing timelines. Everything had to be perfect. The center wouldn't just be a building, it would be a legacy. But not his. It would be Leroy's. He called Leroy's daughter one evening, having found her through a quiet network of local contacts. Her name was Letitia, a schoolteacher in Charlotte. She answered with caution, unsure why someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger was calling her cell phone. But when he explained, when he told her who he was and what he was building, her voice cracked. "He always wanted to do something like that," she whispered. "He used to tell us bedtime stories about this imaginary center where kids could come after school and just be safe." "He won't have to imagine it much longer," Arnold said. Late one night, back in his hotel room, Arnold looked at the paper again. "Maybe it'll be you." He smiled to himself, folded the note gently, and placed it back in the folder. That single sentence had followed him through iron and film and office doors, and now, finally, it was time to honor it. He stared out the window once more. Below, the city kept moving: horns, headlights, endless motion. But in his heart, something had stilled. The boy who once couldn't order a sandwich without help was now building something bigger than himself, not to repay a debt, not for gratitude, but because Leroy had taught him the kind of strength that didn't need to be seen to matter. Strength that gives, strength that lifts. And somewhere deep down, Arnold hoped that when Leroy finally saw what had been done in his name, he would understand. Understand that the help he once gave had grown into something larger than either of them could have imagined. Because sometimes the most powerful promises are the ones we keep long after they're spoken. And sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never asked to be remembered, but were never forgotten. The morning air was crisp, touched with a hint of spring, as Arnold's SUV pulled up in front of the old department store on Central Avenue. The once abandoned building had been transformed, its exterior freshly painted, the sidewalk swept clean, and colorful balloons tied to the handrails. A modest crowd had gathered: some community members, a few local officials, and a group of volunteers in matching t-shirts. But Leroy didn't know any of that yet. He was still sitting in the passenger seat, fidgeting with the cuffs of his shirt, the one good button-down he owned. Arnold had picked him up that morning, saying he wanted him to meet a few donors who had helped with a small project. "Just a quick visit," Arnold had said with a smile. "You'll like it." Leroy had no idea what was waiting for him. As they walked toward the front doors, Leroy noticed something strange. His daughter Letitia was there, standing near the steps, smiling. So was his son Jerome, leaning on his cane, dressed in a blazer. Denise, Tyler, even little Marcus, all were present, waving, dressed sharp, looking proud. Leroy paused on the sidewalk, confused. "What's going on?" he asked. Arnold just nodded toward the entrance. "Come inside," he said. The lobby was bright and open, sunlight pouring through large windows. Leroy stepped in slowly, his eyes scanning the room. There were polished floors, clean white walls, rows of chairs neatly arranged. A long cloth hung across the wall, covering something. People stood quietly, waiting. Arnold placed a hand on Leroy's shoulder and guided him to the center of the room. The buzz of quiet conversation faded. Then Arnold spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "thank you for being here today. This building once stood empty, forgotten. But starting today, it becomes something new, a place of purpose, of hope, of opportunity." He turned to Leroy, his voice steady but full of emotion. "None of this would be possible without a man who once believed in a skinny immigrant kid with broken English and big dreams. A man who taught me that strength isn't just about lifting weights, but lifting people. That man is Leroy Wilson." The crowd applauded. Leroy looked down, unsure what to do with his hands. Then Arnold reached up and pulled the cloth from the wall. Behind it was a sign, sleek and bold, "Wilson and Schwarzenegger Youth Center." Leroy stared. He blinked, his mouth opened, but no words came. His name, first, larger than life, painted into the heart of a building he hadn't even known existed. He took a shaky step back, overwhelmed. "What is this?" he whispered. Arnold smiled. "It's yours." Leroy shook his head slowly, disbelief clouding his face. No, I can't accept this. I don't deserve this." "Yes, when you do," Arnold said. "You always have. This center was built in your honor because you were the first person who believed in me, because you told me I belonged here. Now it's time the kids in this community hear the same thing from you." Leroy looked around, the rooms, the faces, his children, beaming with pride. And suddenly he wasn't the man in the red apron anymore. He wasn't the night shift worker, the man with the sore knees and the forgotten dreams. He was Leroy Wilson, and this was his legacy. Arnold continued. "We're not just naming the building after you. We want you to run it. You'll be the executive director. Your daughter Letitia has already agreed to lead the education programs. Jerome will manage operations. Denise will run the meals and community outreach. Tyler's going to handle the tech. It's a family operation. Your family," Leroy's voice trembled. "I don't know how to run a center. We'll get you trained. We've arranged a nonprofit leadership program at the university. All expenses paid. You're not doing this alone. We believe in you just like you once believed in me." Leroy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The room was quiet now. No one moved. All eyes were on him. He looked at the sign one more time. Wilson and Schwarzenegger. His name, next to a man the world admired. Not out of charity, not out of pity, but out of respect. He stood a little straighter, his shoulders lifted. For the first time in decades, Leroy didn't feel small. He felt seen. He turned to Arnold and nodded slowly. "Then let's give these kids the place we never had." And in that moment, a janitor became a leader. A memory became a mission. And a quiet man who had once changed one life was now about to change hundreds, maybe more. 1 year later, the Wilson and Schwarzenegger Youth Center was no longer just a building. It was a heartbeat. Every morning, the doors opened to a flood of energy kids racing to the basketball courts, teens crowding the computer lab, parents dropping off homework folders and offering tired smiles. The halls echoed with laughter, sneakers squeaking on polished floors, the soft clatter of lunch trays, and at the center of it all was Leroy Wilson. He arrived early, before the sun, unlocking doors and walking the halls in silence, breathing in the calm before the storm. He stayed late, long after the last light flicked off, reviewing notes, returning calls, mopping up spills without complaint. He didn't have to mop anymore. But sometimes old habits die hard. Some weeks he clocked more hours than the staff combined. His limp was a little worse. His back stiffened more often, but he kept going because this place wasn't just a job. It was a promise kept. But it wasn't easy. For every child who blossomed in the reading room or found confidence on the court, there were others who pushed back. Kids who came in angry, closed off, wearing armor shaped by hard homes and broken trust. And no one tested Leroy's resolve more than Malik. Malik was 14, with a permanent scowl and eyes that didn't blink. He showed up late to sessions, cursed at staff, shoved other boys during drills. His file said he'd been suspended 3 times in the last year. His older brother locked up for gang activity, his mother working nights to keep the lights on. From the moment Malik stepped through the doors, Leroy felt something. Not fear, not pity, but recognition. He'd seen that kind of fire before, the kind that burns everything before it warms anything, every week. Malik gave him another reason to give up. He skipped tutoring. He walked out of group sessions. He told a volunteer to shut up and stormed off the court. One afternoon, he punched a hole in the locker room wall after someone called his shoes fake. The board suggested expulsion, but Leroy shook his head. Not yet. He tried everything. He offered Malik extra time in the gym, let him help in the kitchen, asked him to paint one of the new rooms with a group of older teens. Every time. Malik either ignored the offer or half-heartedly participated before disappearing. One Friday, after another outburst, Leroy found Malik sitting behind the center, alone, hoodie pulled tight, a bruise forming on his cheek. Leroy sat next to him without a word. Just silence, just presence. After a few minutes, Malik spoke. "They think I'm going to end up like my brother." Leroy nodded. "Do you think that?" Malik shrugged. "Don't matter. It does to me," Leroy said. "And it should to you." The boy didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. The next week, Malik didn't show up, or the week after. Leroy felt the weight of it, that quiet defeat. Sometimes, no matter how hard you reach, they don't reach back. Then Passion on a Tuesday morning, Leroy turned the key in the center's front door and found Malik sitting on the steps, waiting. He stood up when Leroy approached. "I don't know why you ain't given up on me," Malik muttered, eyes on the ground. Leroy looked at him, quiet for a moment. "Because someone once didn't give up on me." Malik didn't speak. He just stepped forward and, without warning, wrapped his arms around Leroy's waist in a quick, tight hug. It only lasted a second, but it said everything. "Thanks for not leaving," he whispered, and then he walked inside. That night, Leroy sat in his office alone. The building was quiet again, the energy spent. He looked out over the darkened basketball court, the scoreboard glowing faintly above empty bleachers. His legs ached. His back was on fire, but his heart was full. Malik hadn't just come back. He had returned with hope in his eyes. Leroy exhaled, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. It had taken a year, 1,000 conversations, sleepless nights, doubt, exhaustion. But in that moment, he knew. This wasn't just about giving kids a safe space or warm meals. It was about saving lives, sometimes one at a time. And maybe, just maybe, saving a piece of himself along the way. The rooftop was quiet. The last of the celebration noise had faded hours ago, replaced now by the soft hum of the city below. A warm breeze rolled over the edge of the building, carrying with it the faint sounds of laughter from distant streets. The sky above the Wilson and Schwarzenegger Youth Center was clear, stars scattered like salt on black glass. Leroy stood by the railing, hands resting on the metal, eyes tracing the outline of the neighborhood he had called home for decades. Behind him, Arnold stepped out from the stairwell, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He offered one to Leroy, who took it with a nod. Neither man spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. The center's 1-year anniversary had been a success. Hundreds had come through the doors that day. Families, teachers, city leaders, former students. Speeches had been made, photos taken. Kids had run through the halls like they owned the place. It was everything they had hoped for. But here, Under the stars. The weight of memory pressed heavier than applause. Leroy took a sip of the coffee, then looked out again over the city. You ever wonder what might have been? He said. If things had gone differently. Arnold didn't answer right away. He stared out at the skyline, his voice quiet. Every day. Leroy chuckled softly. I think about that night sometimes. The night we left. I've never told anyone the whole story. Not even my kids. Arnold turned to him, silent, listening. My dad worked at a shipping warehouse over in Vernon. Leroy said, hard worker, straight guy. But one day some inventory went missing, electronics. Expensive stuff. They didn't have proof, but his manager pointed the finger. My dad swore up and down he didn't do it. But back then, being a black man accused by a white supervisor didn't leave you with a lot of options. He paused, looking down into his coffee like it held the rest of the story. One night, he came home with this look in his eyes I'd never seen before. Packed a bag, told us to load up the car, said we were leaving town for good. We drove through the night, ended up in Georgia, changed our last name from Wilson to Wilkins, started over. Arnold felt the words land with weight, pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. I begged him to let me say goodbye. Leroy continued, I wanted to call you, write something. He said no. Said the fewer people who knew where we were, the better. I was just a kid. I did what I was told, and after a while, it felt too late. Arnold's voice was low. I knocked on your door for a week. No one ever answered. Leroy's eyes glistened. I know. I'm sorry. Arnold nodded, then looked down at the courtyard below. I searched for you, he said. After I made it, after the championships, the movies, the politics, I still thought about you. I hired people, checked records, but with the name change, there was nothing. You vanished. Leroy turned to face him. I thought you'd forgotten. Arnold's voice cracked. I never forgot. I didn't look for you because you helped me. I looked for you because I never got to say thank you. Silence stretched between them, thick and raw. Then Arnold motioned toward the stairwell. There's something I want to show you. They walked down to the second floor, where the lights were dim, the center now closed for the night. Arnold led him to a door at the end of the hall. On it was a small plaque trophy room. He opened the door, and Leroy stepped inside. The room was warm and quiet, polished wooden floors, recessed lights casting soft halos across glass cases. Most of the shelves were still empty, waiting for future memories. But in the center of the room stood one large display, already filled. Inside was a worn leather basketball, cracked and faded with time. Next to it, a pair of old iron dumbbells, standard, rusted, the kind they had lifted together in the dusty gym all those years ago. And beneath them, in a simple frame, was a piece of lined notebook paper, yellowed, fragile. Leroy leaned closer, his breath caught in his throat. Written in pencil, in his own handwriting, were the words, maybe it won't be me, maybe it'll be you. His signature, Arnold's, side by side. Leroy didn't speak. He couldn't. Arnold stood beside him. My mother found it in one of my old trunks. I kept it all these years. I didn't know why. Until now. Leroy placed his hand gently on the glass. This was the first promise I ever made that really mattered. Arnold said, and this center, it's where that promise lives now. Tears slid down Leroy's cheeks as he nodded. Slowly, silently. They stood there together, not as a billionaire and a janitor, not as a celebrity and a man from the shadows, but as two boys who once dreamed big under a California sun. Outside, the city pulsed with noise and life, but inside the trophy room, there was only peace. Two lives that had once diverged had finally come full circle, and beneath the soft glow of the lights, a friendship that had weathered time, silence, and distance found its voice again, not in applause, not in headlines, but in gratitude, in memory, and in a legacy that would outlive them both. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.